the dominant theme of what we're looking at in global cities in an era of change is resilience. What do cities have to do to be thriving in 20 years? You're known for your long-term macro view of the world. Let's take demographics first. We have a rather dramatic shift in demographics in this country, particularly those who are growing old and getting out of business, and those who are young and frankly often seem like they don't know about business. Tell us about what you think the demographics are changing in society, in real estate, consumerism, investment opportunities.
Well, I think that we're in the middle of perhaps one of the great demographic changes in history. I graduated from the University of Michigan on June 10th, 1963. I was married June 18th. By 1 year later, 95% of everybody who we interfaced with was married, some of them even had children. So think about what that means. That means that the engineer who graduated from Michigan or Illinois or Stanford or whatever, in the 60s, by the time he graduated, he'd probably be married. And he'd move to Ticky-Tacky-ville and buy a single-family detached house. He'd get in his car every morning and he'd drive to the campus of Motorola or Merck or whoever the big company was that built these huge suburban campuses. In 1965, Motorola built a huge campus 35 miles northwest of Chicago. By 1995, Motorola was renting 200,000 square feet of office space in downtown Chicago at the same time as its suburban complex was 40% occupied. What does that all mean? What it really means, and it has enormous implications for cities, has enormous implications for our economy. Basically, we've taken a group, roughly, let's call them 21 to 30, and they literally were buying diapers, and now they're buying lattes for about the same per person. And so this is changing the cities, it's changing the utilization, it's changing the real estate business. I mean, we for 25 years built 1 million single-family houses a year. Since 2008, with the full recovery that's supposed to have happened, we're up to 500,000 houses a year. So we've eliminated 500,000 new houses, new furniture, new lawns, new everything. And that money is being, redirected to Gold's Gym and Starbucks. We're the largest owner of multifamily housing in CBDs of America. We went public in 1993, and we were an $800 million company, all suburban garden apartments. At the time, the definition of a successful garden apartment project was expressway visibility. Expressway visibility. Today, the answer or the question is, what's the walking score? How many steps to Starbucks? How many steps to the gym? How many steps to the subway? This is a very, very changed environment. Now, what we don't know is what happens when these people turn 30 and 32 and when they get married, assuming that they get married. And what impact will that have on the cities? What impact will that have on the school systems? Because I think one of the results of this dramatic change is, I think, an even lower fertility rate than we have right now. So I think the cities of the future are going to be affected by, you call them millennials. I don't think they're millennials. I don't know what a millennial is, okay? I think they're, people who in their 20s have enormous disposable income that the generations before them never had. And the results are very different. The capital is being spent differently. I asked the guy who runs our apartment company, how many of our tenants own cars? Interesting question, isn't it? The number is under 50%. Can you imagine when you and I, got out of school, anybody without a car? How could that be? But in fact, and I think, by the way, it's going down, okay? And technology is very much a contributor. What Uber has done is it's created certainty, meaning I can go on the app and I know somebody is coming. That all of a sudden means maybe I don't need a car, because what I need is transportation, not a car. And so all of these things are radically and rapidly changing the environment and how we as real estate people respond to them. The gentleman was up here before, was talking about affordable housing. Affordable housing, military intelligence, and other oxymorons are nothing more than oxymorons. Affordable housing is all about cost. And here we are sitting in Palo Alto, California, perhaps having the most difficult zoning laws in the United States, making new construction as impossible and as expensive as humanly possible. And it's from this podium that we advocate affordable housing. If you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you. And as a matter of fact, I should at this point acknowledge that I have been lying to everybody for years about the fact that I had a bridge to sell them. I really didn't. But now, I own a bridge. So when I tell you guys, I got a bridge to sell you, it's not really for sale, but it is, and it's, by the way, down on the border with Mexico. And the bridge basically is a walking bridge into the Tijuana airport. So people can take long-distance flights out of San Diego.
Fantastic.
But, overall, this is just a gargantuan change, a gargantuan, we have all these people to deal with and respond to in manners that we've never had to deal with before.
Sure. I talked a little bit yesterday about Reno and as a place where there's a giant sucking sound coming across the border from California. And who are those people? And they fit the demographic you described perfectly.
Sure.
That's exactly where they are. So how are we seeing the same trends in developed countries, Europe? How does it affect the rest of the world?
I think we're seeing the developed trends everywhere in the world. Just think about it. Mexico, 15 years ago, probably had a fertility rate of 5.5. Today, its fertility rate is 2.5. India, 7 or 8 fertility rate. Today, it's 2 something. That's the developed world. And that's the undeveloped world or the developing world. In the developed world, how many countries in Europe this year will have less people in them in December than there were in January? This is a worldwide phenomena, and to some extent, it's very much related to the delivery of information, which is educating people all over the world to what may be defined as a better life.
Yeah. When we get to emerging markets, that we have a long, sustained, anemic global economic growth. How's that impacting the emerging markets and their ability for a middle class to arise?
Well, the rise of the middle class in the emerging markets, which very much was the case roughly from 1995 to 2005 or 8, which was basically a super commodity cycle that pumped enormous amounts of capital and foreign investment and liquidity into the developing markets. The impact of that, as you might expect, was that you had significant movement from poverty to the first steps of the middle class. Unfortunately, that's starting to erode.
Yeah.
And, just like the seesaw goes up, the seesaw is going back. In a country like Brazil, that probably had the highest percentage of conversion to middle class of any country in the world, you're now seeing it slide back. You're now seeing unemployment as demand worldwide shrinks.
Sure. Other than demographics, what core elements of resilience, core elements impact resilience in U.S. cities?
Well, it starts and ends with the word leadership. To the extent that there is leadership in a community, there's progress. And you look around the country and you can just see the strong leader who's having an impact on his city and the weak leader who's kicking the can down the road. Yeah. And we certainly have more than one example of both in the United States today. So I think leadership is very important. Obviously, geography is very important. I mean, until a year ago, being in Houston sounded like an awfully exciting place to be, demand, et cetera, et cetera. If you've been to Houston recently, it's pretty scary and pretty sad.
Yeah, very, very different.
Go to the other way. You just saw General Electric move from Connecticut to Boston. Now, I grew up with the idea that Boston was part of Massachusetts. But in fact, Massachusetts has gotten a lot better. Leadership, again. But, they have focused in the Boston area as just this giant magnet, just like Silicon Valley is a giant magnet. Now, in some cases, I'd add, the leadership says, aha, I got the golden fleece, and I'm going to make the rules.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that's what's happened with zoning in California.
Absolutely. So, which cities are getting it right? What are the characteristics of leadership that are going to help cities to become more resilient and to thrive?
I think that, when I think about the United States today and I think about where I want to invest, I probably would identify Seattle as the #1 market in the United States. It has all of the elements for success. One, it's got all kinds of barriers to entry.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more water and there's more bridges and there's more reasons to screw everything up in Seattle than almost any other city in the country. Obviously, that creates scarcity.
Sure.
And when it creates scarcity, it creates a very healthy environment for a real estate owner. In addition, they've done a fabulous job of attracting and accommodating industry. The ability of Amazon and other these companies to develop these huge campuses, et cetera, couldn't have happened without significant local support. So I put Seattle kind of at the top of my list in the country as a city to play in. Another city that I think is in great shape is Dallas, despite the oil patch, because Dallas has massively diversified over the last 25 years, and a very libertarian environment that makes it an attractive place to move. On the other hand, I own no real estate in Dallas. I used to. Before, I used to be in the public company business. If you control a public company, the name of the game is consistency, transparency, predictability. In a market like Dallas, where there is no barrier to entry, it's basically up and down. So until 1993, I was a buyer in Dallas, and then I was a seller in Dallas, then I was a buyer in Dallas, and just basically rode the cycles. But all of those cycles were always positive. New York is one of everybody's favorite markets. I think it's a very, very difficult market. First of all, it's a little bit like, going into Dallas or going into Texas and as a developer, you're basically going into the den of thieves. I mean, there's no shortage of developers in Dallas. There's no shortage of developers in New York. Like previous examples, some one event triggers a reaction in that market that I think the city is going to end up paying for big time. I mean, somebody sold an apartment for $100 million. That meant that there was somebody who would buy an apartment for $10,000 or $12,000 a square foot. So therefore, the market started building $12,000 a square foot market units, and they ain't selling. That building that sold the $100 million apartment last week or 2 weeks ago took 30 or 40 of the empty apartments and put them in a rental pool.
No.
Yes, in a rental pool. They sold all last year. They sold 3 units. And the answer comes down again. It's exactly what we're talking about, affordable housing. It's affordability. It's there's somebody somewhere in the world who is going to pay $100 million or whatever to buy an apartment. But how do you translate that into a herd? I don't understand.
Agreed.
So I think we're seeing changes. We're seeing, for example, significant office construction in New York City, and we're seeing weakness in the market. And I'd say, generally speaking, I think this market has probably peaked. And the question is going to become what happens now. And I think the $64 question for the market, and particularly this market, is how much of everybody's rent comes from profits or VC contributions. We bought SPIRE properties in 2000 here, and we discovered what it meant when you have a whole bunch of employees who are being paid by VCs contributing capital rather than the profitability of their companies. And most of them disappeared.
So tell me about your position in the office market today. You sold EOP.
Yep.
Where do you look at the office market as not being a place you want to play today?
In 2007, we sold equity office properties. It's the largest transaction that anybody had ever done. Everybody said, I was calling the top of the market. That was really an accident. The reality is somebody made me a Godfather offer, and I accepted it. And as a chairman of a public company, my responsibility is to my shareholders first and foremost. And it was my baby, and I created it, but in the end, you succeed by being a hard-nosed realist. And since that time, we've invested in a couple of office buildings and sold them, and then we took over a REIT with $7 billion worth of office space, and we've sold about $4 billion of it so far. I think the U.S. real estate market is, I keep using the word benign, which in my interpretation means hard to see it going up anywhere from here. I think the risks of it going down and softening are significant, and that's not even counting the reverse of cap rate compression.
To what degree, if you look at markets, you take San Francisco and New York, where particularly office rents, but also residential costs are so high, and the disparity in other cities, because I live in Reno now, I've become a student of that, the dramatic difference, it's 1/10 the cost for housing, 1/10 the cost for office space.
But, Ed, you moved to Reno, Nevada.
Correct.
And you have a real live, if you look out your window every day, an ability to see the difference between a community that is focused on growth and focused on making it happen, and therefore attacking by supply, attacking the whole issue of affordability. There is no way other than a controlled command society that you can create affordable housing. You could only create affordable housing by increasing supply, and therefore creating more options. What you have in California and a number of other places is you have basically political decisions that say we're going to increase the zoning, we're going to increase the sustainability, and pretty soon you're going to eliminate all the people because nobody can afford to live there.
That is clear in so many jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Looking at regulation for a moment, California may be at the top of the heap when it comes to over-regulating. Everything from real estate to labor laws to most everything that touches our lives. And what are the policy directions we should be taking to roll back some of that regulation?
I think you start with a scythe. I mean, basically, compliance costs in the United States, locally and at the federal level, have probably doubled since 2008.
Yep.
Doubled. Interestingly enough, productivity has gone just the opposite.
It is going down.
So why? Because effectively, the more you create compliance costs, the less productive everybody is. And I think this is a staggering conundrum for the whole United States.
Which pulls us into the more global view. Do we finally make ourselves so unaffordable as a country that the economies shift toward the developing world?
Well, that's a very broad question I don't know the answer to, but I'm very concerned about the evolution of our country. We're a very unique country in the world. No country that I know of in the history of the world has ever grown or prospered like this one has, and I think it's very much correlated to freedom. And freedom is the ability to do things. It's not the ability to prevent other people from doing things.
Yeah, I totally subscribe to that. Let's talk about education for a moment and where it fits into this scenario of where are we going. What are you seeing in trends from city to city concerning education, the accessibility, and I mean from K to 12. The university system is a little different, but K to 12, what are we doing? Who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong?
Probably the number one city in the country doing it right is New Orleans. New Orleans had the benefit of Katrina. Katrina, number one, wiped out half of its population, and number two, forced the city and the state to address the question of education from a different perspective. And they turned over the education system in New Orleans to Teach for America. And the results have been off the charts.
Tell us about Teach for America.
Well, Teach for America was, the idealism of the millennials. And by the way, I met with the president of Teach for America the other day, or my wife did, and she said, and as I predicted when I was talking to my wife about it a number of years ago, as soon as the economy gets better, idealism goes south. And so, needless to say, Teach for America is having a hell of a time recruiting kids that they previously, had to turn away. So I think what it is an attempt to identify highly educated, aggressive kids who want to make a difference. And Teach for America has set up the opportunity within, CBDs, not just New Orleans, all over the country, for these kids to enter the school systems and be contributors. Obviously, there is a direct correlation between urban America and the question of education. And again, we go back to this issue of affordability. Mm-hmm. In order to protect the unions, we have perhaps the worst school systems anywhere in the world. At the same time, over the last 10 years, we've had an enormous proliferation of private schools.
Yeah.
Why? Obviously, you want to stay in the city, you want to be an urban person, you want to educate your kids, you're never going to send them to Chicago public school system.
So you take a city like Manhattan, like New York, and you put Bill de Blasio in, who's trying to tear apart the charter schools.
Yep.
versus what...
I didn't mention him as a leader, did I?
No, I don't think so. All right, time to move on. So you've always been a strong supporter of fostering entrepreneurism. Why and what role do you see in economic growth to a community that really embraces its entrepreneurs?
Well, maybe I should give you a little history. I'm the son of immigrants. I was born 90 days after my parents came to this country. And so I grew up in a very immigrant environment and a very, very entrepreneurial environment because, nobody would hire immigrants. They had to basically start their own businesses, and they did. And as I went off to school and I spent time went to the University of Michigan, it became obvious to me that the business schools were rote formula manufacturers. The $64 question asked by every student was, what's the formula? If you teach me the formula, then I can just apply it and get the answers. Well, reality is far from that. And in the late 70s, I got into a conversation with the head of the business school, and I said, how can you not teach entrepreneurship? How can you not bring this out and get these people challenged accordingly? And we ended up doing a program where we ran a national contest. And the winner, and the purpose of the contest was to design a course in how to teach entrepreneurship. And the winner got $25,000 and a one-year appointment to the University of Michigan Business School to teach the class that the syllabus had created. And we had some fabulous, did it for 5 or 6 years. We had a guy whose concept was failure 101, meaning you couldn't be a successful entrepreneur until you understood rejection, et cetera, et cetera. And then I met with the dean and the faculty, and I said, this is really important. I'm prepared to fund it. And I said, you guys have to come up with the academic class. And they said, fine. They get back to me, and that was in 1987. They haven't gotten back to me yet, but, I'm only 74, so, I could still wait. But basically, the faculty considered entrepreneurship junk science. Finally, in 1995, I created a program at the University of Michigan to focus on entrepreneurship. Then I created one in Israel, and then I created one in Northwestern. And this has been an extraordinarily enlightening experience for me because even though I talked a good game about how important entrepreneurship was and the challenge, and entrepreneurs don't just see problems, they see solutions, et cetera, et cetera. But to talk that way is one thing. To see it and live it is another. In Israel, we basically run a program where we have 24 kids a year. And they break up and build a company. In the 15 years since the program started, the program has monetized $400 million in companies created in the classroom. At Michigan, they've focused on the academic side of it. But the whole purpose of it is to wrap everybody up into the concept. Now, today, at least, it's everybody's favorite word. Okay, so every university is, quote, trying to create an entrepreneurship program. But what an entrepreneurship program is really all about is saying, what are your skills, what are your abilities, and how do you see the world, and how can you take that perspective and convert it into something that's beneficial for society?
Yep.
And I define beneficial as society as something that others are willing to pay for.
Exactly.
Whether it be nonprofit or not, that's irrelevant. But that's the test, in other words, and much of the philanthropic world doesn't meet that test.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And you look at a community like Silicon Valley, and they're just companies popping out of the woodwork. What do you think the ingredients are that make a Silicon Valley as successful as it's been?
Scale. I mean, in other words, it's the oldest story in the book. Why did we end up with all the car manufacturers in Detroit? Why do we end up with all the high-tech guys here? Why do we end up with the aerospace guys in Southern California, et cetera? Or it's just a town in Indiana called Stryker that makes all of the body parts. And I just had a hip replacement. Probably was made there. This is some dipshit town in Indiana, and the three largest manufacturers of artificial limbs all are in this one community. How can that be? And the answer is that one guy, whoever that one guy was, maybe it was Mr. Stryker, and he started, and then somebody who worked for him spun off. That's called entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well, entrepreneurship is the actualization of an idea. How do you encourage that? I know up in Reno we have the best entrepreneurial support system, I would say, meaning mentor group. The Economic Development Authority started a thing called Summit VMS, which is a series of mentors that take these young kids under the arm and help them to actualize their idea. So, on infrastructure, we're suffering in America certainly from underfunding our infrastructure and for deteriorated infrastructure. What should we be doing?
Spending money on infrastructure.
Yeah, I know, but where's it going to come from? How are we going to motivate politicians?
We did a $1 trillion bullshit stimulus bill.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Infrastructure, shovel-ready. I don't know what we built. A hen house? I mean, that was $1 trillion to build a hen house.
I have no
it just
idea
doesn't
where
make
all
any
that
sense.
money went.
So the answer is really simple. You got to want to do it. You got to have the political support to do it. You got to have the leadership that instead of wasting money on extending unemployment rates or other things that are consumption, you got to make investments in our future. But it requires leadership. And at least so far, we ain't have it.
Which states, the governors have changed rather dramatically in the last couple of election periods. What states have good leadership today? Mike
Pence in Indiana has been unbelievable. I mean, he has really been terrific. I think Kasich in Ohio has done just a terrific job. I think, despite the Flint problem, I think Rick Snyder deserves a lot of credit.
Michigan has definitely changed.
They have changed, and they're continuing to change. Those are, three, very strong examples. And if you want to take the other side, you can take Illinois, where there's been no leadership, and the state is just sitting there waiting to go bankrupt.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and my three states that I just picked is very clear examples. There are obviously many other examples across the country.
What are the characteristics that Pence and Kasich and so forth, what are they doing?
They're realism. They're realists. Okay. They're basically saying, hey guys, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. We know where we want to go. We have to eliminate all the squiggles that all different, special interest groups, are pushing to push it one way or the other. We got to be able to say, here's what we need, and here's how we're going to get it done. I mean, the founding fathers created a republic. They didn't create a democracy. We are on the edge now of going from a republic to a democracy. And by the way, the next step after a democracy is anarchy. And I just think we have overplayed everybody's opinion on everything. And the result is we can't get anything done. I mean, even if you economically legislate the capital for those infrastructure projects, how long did it take to get the Alaskan pipeline done? 15 years? 15 years, and all kinds of people filing lawsuits, not putting up bonds, just delaying and delaying at no cost to them. Not a program that's going to produce the kind of infrastructure we need.
Let's take a look at the emerging markets. Let's get out of the United States for a moment. What are the biggest influencers in emerging markets on creating resilience? Is there anyone doing it right? Creating investment grade status?
Well, we starting in 1997 basically invested in real estate companies all over the emerging market. China, India, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Colombia. And the first thing we kind of accidentally discovered was that as we looked at those markets, we found that those countries that were close to investment grade were the most disciplined. So we invested in Mexico after the tequila crisis, and we rode the 3 years to investment grade, and it was fabulous. No government in the world is more disciplined than when they're just on the verge of investment grade, because if you get to investment grade, there's an absolute reward. I mean, you can measure it the next day. So this whole idea of discipline, of predictability are extraordinarily important. I also think that it takes a lot of bravery. I mean, when President, I think it's Nieto, the president of Mexico, took on Pemex and the oil business, and I mean, Mexico, not necessarily tomorrow, but over the next years, is going to benefit immensely from eliminating the stranglehold on something that produces 40% of the revenue of the country. So I take my hat off to him and say, boy, that took a lot of guts and a lot of political capital to do it.
Yeah.
You look around the world and you try and identify examples of people, leaders using a lot of their political capital because they see the right direction.
Yeah, and you see the results. The net migration is going south today, not north. So,
well, look at the United States. I mean, again, is it accidental that the whole migration in the country is going south and west? Yeah. Connected to the fact that south and west is where you have the most, I was going to use the word liberal, but that's not the right word, but you have the most laissez-faire, societies.
Leave them alone. Talk about Brazil and some of the other countries where leadership really is in a crisis, I believe.
Well, I mean, we first invested in Brazil right after President Lula was elected. President Lula had been a labor leader. He was very, very popular. And when he got elected, he was very disciplined. He was a social liberal and an economic conservative, and he applied it exactly in that fashion, and Brazil just boomed. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. By the end of his first term, his economic strength wasn't quite what it was when he started, and his social orientation was more. By the end of the second term, he looked a lot like a lot of other countries in Latin America that were very undisciplined. Unfortunately, he was followed by Dilma, and Dilma was just a total, talk about dumb. I mean, she decided that, classic mercantilist, we're going to build everything in Brazil. So, of course, the biggest things being built in Brazil was stuff for the offshore oil industry. So here you have companies in Korea that have spent 80 years building and learning how to build drill ships. And the next day in Brazil, some local company gets some kind of a contract to build a drill ship, and they have not a clue what to do. And this was repeated over and over and over again. And the net effect was that, the country is on its growth rate was -4 last year. It's truly a mess. I think they're going to impeach the president. But, there is no substitute for discipline. And when we invest in all these countries around the world, we keep looking for discipline. We keep looking for, do they have leadership? Do they have a history where, and obviously I can't use the U.S. as the standard, but I also can't use Venezuela as the standard.
That's right. So if we kind of consider the economy and where it's going, you've got South America between Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, they're all caving. I mean, there's a descent. The U.S. is
Yeah.
turbulent.
Well, but, let's simplify the question you're asking. You're basically asking, what's the perspective for the world?
Right.
And my answer to you is, tell me where the demand is. In other words, there is nothing more critical than where is the demand. Can you identify a country of scale in the world that's growing at more than 3%? Forget about China's bullshit numbers. But except for China, that really produces numbers by appointment rather than reality. Everywhere else. I mean, India used to grow at 6, it's growing at 3.5. Mexico used to grow at 6, it's now growing at 2.5. So the challenge and the question as a worldwide investor, whether it be the United States or anywhere else, is where is the demand? And we clearly have a world in which there's a dearth of demand. There is truly a shortage of demand. What does that lead to? Among other things, it leads to beggar thy neighbor policies. So in the last year, with the dollar at close to an all-time high in strength, we've seen the Japanese yen devalued by 30%, the euro devalued by 30%, the Russian ruble devalued by 50%, the real, the Brazilian by 65%. So effectively, and now we see the Chinese currency starting to play around with it, we basically have gone from a world in which there was significant demand to one where there's a shortage of demand, and a lot of countries are playing the currency game in an attempt to overcome the impact. Sure. And 1930s told us that wasn't the policy that led to growth. I would remind all of you that in 1944 we had the Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods Agreement, which was just before the end of World War II, basically said the world is a mess. How is the world going to recover? There's only one way the world can recover, and that's through the increase in free trade. You can't have increases in free trade without stable currencies. So Bretton Woods was an attempt, and a successful one, to create those stable currencies. In the last 12 months, world trade is down in value 14%. I think, short of very severe recessions, that's the first time since World War II that there has been a diminution in world trade. I remind all of you and myself that it all started with barter. And I'll trade you my horse for your 2 cats. And then it got cumbersome to carry all the cats and all the dogs. So then somebody said, let's use gold or silver. And then they went from gold or silver. And then they said, well, gee, we should do coins. And then we did coins. And then somebody said, well, we'll do paper backed by gold. And then we took away the gold. And so here we are with a world of fiat currencies where the volatility of those currencies and how they interface is critically important to how the world survives. The idea that the U.S. can do good while the rest of the world sucks is just not even possible. We have a terribly interconnected world, and we can't lose sight of that, because if we do, we'll all end up in a 30s recession or depression.
Let's ask for some questions from you all. Yes, Howie. Get Howie a mic here.
Sam, can you share your views on the current political, presidential election, possible impact on the economy, real estate? What's your take on all that?
My first choice would be to take a 4-year vacation. My second choice would be to take an 8-year vacation. I think that the current political environment couldn't be worse on both sides. I think Hillary Clinton is as weak candidate has probably ever been put up and most vulnerable. It's hard for me to identify Donald Trump as a candidate. On the other hand, what I've been telling everybody for 6 months is I know Don, I've dealt with Don. I don't think I would be a Don supporter, but I've also told everybody underestimating this man is a huge, huge mistake. I think the country is very angry, and I think that's what we're really seeing. I don't remember in my life as extraordinary a disparity between the coasts and the rest of the country, but the disparity is staggering. The people are angry. The people are unhappy. The people feel as though they haven't been listened to. The people feel as though the people in Washington, drew a line and said these guys are going to be, taken care of, and the West Virginia miner, fuck them, and they've done a good job, even without KY. So I think that I think we have a very divisive environment. I think we have, frankly, suffered from an enormous lack of leadership, and there's a big difference between leadership and winning. I think leadership is what our country needs. Winning would be terrific at times, but you end up automatically winning if you have good leadership. If your focus is only on winning, I don't think that's the case. So I'm not terribly optimistic. I'm hopeful that on the Republican side, they can figure out a way to put up a viable and intelligent candidate. On the Democratic side, I don't know what happens. The idea of another 4 years of Lincoln bedrooms and all of the other sleaze that goes with that is something that I would have a heart as an American. Forget about Democrat, Republican. Just as an American, we just can't go through that again. Am I being too subtle? I could talk slower.
With these lights, I can't see who has their hand up. Sorry.
Yes.
Sam, as the son of immigrants, can you give us your 4-point Sam Zell comprehensive immigration policy for the U.S.? And I'm presuming your immigrant family was also refugee. So if
No.
you could...
Well, yeah, within the term refugees, my parents, quote, got out of Europe 24 hours before the beginning of World War II. So maybe they're refugees or not. But the answer is, yeah, I mean, my parents came to this country in May, and I was born in September. What's the question?
Could you wrap in the refugee issue with your immigration?
Well, I mean, my attitude on immigration is very simple, and that is that this is a country built of immigrants. Immigrants, by definition, are self-selective. I mean, I have in my own family, my mother and father each had 5 other siblings. They pleaded with the others to leave with them. None of them left. They all died, and my parents survived. So that's a selective process, and it's those kinds of people who came to this country and built it and made it great. I don't remember a lot of grandmothers coming here and, in effect, starting major businesses or employing people in the United States. We need an immigration policy that is in the U.S. interest. And the U.S. interests are that we should attract the best people in the world who can make the biggest contribution. And the idea that we're educating people and then getting rid of them is insane. And the idea that our whole immigration policy is based on who you're related to as opposed to what you can do for the country. How could you have an immigration policy that has any other standard than positive impact for the country? And my attitude on that is unchanged, and I think most of these politicians are just crazy and appealing to the uneducated, for lack of a better word. As far as the refugee situation is concerned, it's almost inconceivable to me that a country the size of Germany could absorb 1.5 million refugees at any given point. So the task is staggering. I don't even know how you begin. But on the other hand, if you look at what the Europeans have not done since the whole Syrian mess began, the refugee crisis is almost predictable. So I have mixed emotions. I'm sympathetic for the refugees. I'm sympathetic for the countries. But I'm also critical of the fact that this refugee onslaught is very much a result of failure to lead and failure to have a real policy to deal with what was really going on in the Middle East.
Yes. And
thank you for being here today, Sam. You had mentioned that you thought that real estate was probably at the top of the market, at least that's what I understood. What do you see happening in real estate for the next 2 years?
I think that it's hard to make a case for ebullience in real estate. I mean, let's talk about what drives the real estate business. Growth. We've got pretty weak growth. Demographics. Our fertility rate is going down, not going up. We've had an enormous amount of liquidity that has influenced the market and driven down cap rates. So what's, other than using other people's money, and by the way, that's a factor in the real estate business today, much greater than it ever was. What's the motivation to take the risk in a real estate market that is not necessarily ebullient? And in fact, I think we're likely to see, lower occupancy rates across the board as supply continues to increase. I mean, we had a 2 or 3 year period there where we had almost no supply increase in multifamily. Now we've had a significant increase, and there's significantly more on the table for the next year or two. So it's likely that those extraordinary rents and increases in the multifamily space are likely to be diminished. On the office space side, I don't think there's any significant demand factors. I mean, yes, you can go into Silicon Valley or somewhere else where there might be a very strong demand factor, but overall, it's hard to identify where the demand is. You go to the retail side, and we're still dealing with what's the impact of online, and how much more is it going to take out of retail brick and mortar sales. And yes, the big super malls are doing great, and the little neighborhood strip centers are doing fine, and everybody else is getting killed, and more likely going to do worse tomorrow than they did yesterday. You got other areas where people have invested in warehousing, and certainly that has been okay. But again, supply and demand says that it's hard to make a case that we're going to see real estate values increase. And it's I've been at this since 1960-something or 1950-something. This is the lowest cap rates we've ever seen. So if the cap rates are at the lowest rates you've ever seen, it's like Mike Milken, when I first met him, explained to me that in the 80s, he bought all this junk debt. And he said, it's very simple. If you bought a corporate bond that was at a 3% return and it wasn't going to change. If you bought a junk bond, the company could get better, it could change, it could get better. In the same manner, in an environment as we have today, it seems to me that there's much more on the downside than there is on the upside.
So feel free to criticize this question as well as answer it.
I'm sorry?
Feel free to criticize this question as well as to answer it.
I haven't shown any restraint, have I?
No, you haven't. So years ago, we used to say what was good for General Motors was good for the country. But it seems these days we have some of the largest and most profitable corporations saying they want things that are very different than large portions of the polity want, especially as it relates to investment in infrastructure or investment in education. How should we think about reconciling what corporations say they want and what actually happens in our fiscal policy, in our budgetary policy?
Well, I guess I'd begin by asking, the last time I checked, I didn't see that corporations had any massive influence on what was really going on. I think think tanks, I think lobbyists, I think the political pundits, play a much bigger role in that than, quote, corporations. I think in the days of, that statement, what's good for General Motors is good for the country, this was a very, very, very different country. And frankly, General Motors was a much, much bigger player in that country than any company is today. So we've changed our society, and I think that public policy has always been made, by the political system, which includes all those characters I just mentioned. But I don't. If anything, I think U.S. corporations have lost significant political influence over the last 10 or 15 years.
Sam, can we put your name up for president?
I'm sorry?
Can we put you up for president of the United States?
The answer is that I have a few other things that I need to do. But thank you for the compliment.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for being here. The home ownership rate since the 1960s has been in that low 60% range, and then from mid-90s through the mid-2000s, it went up almost to 70%, and now it's back to 60%. As the largest owner of residential apartments, do you see that 60% rate as being stable going forward, or do you see any change in the current generation where they're preferring more to rent versus own?
I think that, first of all, if you follow home ownership, without exception since World War II, any time home ownership went above 64%, you had significant oversupply. Every single time. 2006-07 was no different than the previous periods where we've had, excess encouragement to buy homes, and frankly, by a lot of people who can't afford them. That was before the demographic change and the changes of, frankly, the 21st century. If I were sitting here today and I were predicting where we would be in 2025, I would be comfortable suggesting that number was probably at that point in the 50s, and maybe even the low 50s. And then you'd say, well, how do you have a society that doesn't, have skin in the game? Nobody realizes that 40% of, the home ownership rate in Germany is only 40%. It became a political, you remember Barney Frank, is basically responsible for the subprime crisis. In 2000, Fannie and Freddie owned zero subprime debt. They had no risk in that arena at all. And then in 2002, Barney Frank basically bludgeoned Fannie and Freddie into the subprime business. and the results, are what happened. So I guess what I would say to you is that we're moving, I think, as a society from suburbanization to more urbanization. I see nothing on the horizon that is likely to change that. I think we're moving to a society where the car is less important than it was, which, by the way, has all kinds of implications on suburban housing and stuff like that. So I think it's very likely that 10 years from now, we will see a significant lower percentage of home ownership, and I think that reflects change in lifestyle.
We're going to be right here in the back, and it's our last question.
Hi. Can you speak to some of the innovation that you guys are incorporating in your projects? Yesterday we had Chip Conley speak to us about Airbnb.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. I can't understand you.
The innovations that
Yeah.
you're incorporating in your projects. Yesterday Chip Conley spoke about Airbnb being utilized in some of your communities. That's my first question. Second question is, as Gen Y has children, do you think they will leave the urban core?
Let me answer the second question first. I think that they will do almost anything they can to avoid leaving the urban core, and including having less children. And frankly, whether they can or not is going to be very much affected by what happens to the school systems. But I think the desire to live in an urban area, to be able to go across the street and get a newspaper, etc., I think is an extraordinarily powerful scenario that is likely to perpetuate through more than just one generation. As far as innovation is concerned, innovation is ultimately always stroked by economics, and I challenge all my people all the time to ask the question of what or how or in what way might it be different, and how can we make it a better experience and therefore translatable into higher revenue or higher productivity. And I think that, again, leadership is an extraordinarily important part of that. If leadership is open, if leadership is interested, if leadership is willing to take risk, then innovation can and should be an integral part of every company. Thank you.